Beautiful Forever, The Madame Rachel Scandal. A Victorian true crime story of beauty, money, and shame. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. A good scandal is never only about the person at the center of it. It is about a hunger that already exists and the shape a society gives that hunger when it becomes embarrassing. Victorian London was a city that sold respectability by the yard. It sold it in cloth and jewellery and manners, in street addresses and the tilt of a bonnet, in a woman's complexion held up as evidence of her virtue and her worth. It was also a city that punished women for aging, punished them for wanting, punished them for being visible in the wrong way, and punished them, quietly, constantly, for having bodies that did not obey the era's fantasies. Where there is punishment, there is a market. And where there is a market, someone always learns how to profit. Madame Rachel built her name in the place where private fear met public display. She offered more than creams and treatments. She offered relief from the dread of being judged, the dread of being replaced, the dread of being laughed at behind gloved hands. Her promise was not subtle. It was bold enough to sound like a spell. Beautiful forever. The phrase is almost comic now, but it was not comic to the women who came to her. It was a bargain. It was an idea that felt like rescue. It was a way to believe for a moment that time could be negotiated the way other things were negotiated in London, through money, through secrecy, through the right door opened by the right person. This story is not written to mock those women. It is written to show the machinery that made them vulnerable, the social pressure that made beauty feel like survival, and the legal and moral structures that made certain kinds of desperation unspeakable. It is also written to follow what happens when that vulnerability is leveraged, when the promise becomes power, and power becomes a trap. A beauty woman sounds harmless until the case file opens. Then she becomes a question. How did a salon turn into a scandal? And why did so many respectable people help to keep it alive? Chapter 1, Bond Street. London knew how to make a woman feel watched. It did it with mirrors and shop windows and carriage doors that opened onto crowded pavements. It did it with the soft violence of comparison, whose dress was newer, whose skin looked smoother, whose husband stood closer, whose name carried better. A woman could walk through the fashionable streets and feel herself becoming an object assembled from details: gloves, hemline, posture, the calmness of her mouth. In a city built on display, a woman's face became evidence. Evidence was expensive. Bond Street was not simply a street. It was a stage where money learned manners and manners learned money. The shop fronts spoke in a language of assurance: clean glass, polished brass, restrained signage that implied everything behind it was better than ordinary life. The women who moved there were expected to look as if their bodies were under control. Control, in this world, was moral. Aging was treated as a lapse. A line at the mouth could be read as carelessness, weakness, failure. The cruelty of it was rarely said aloud, which made it more powerful. A woman would hear it in compliments that landed like corrections, in invitations that slowed, in the sudden warmth shown to younger faces. The message was consistent: beauty was not only decoration. It was leverage. Leverage makes people do strange things. It makes them seek private solutions to public threats. The first time a woman steps into a place like Madame Rachel's, she is not necessarily thinking, I am about to be deceived. She is thinking, I have a problem I cannot admit to having. She is thinking, if I lose my place, I lose more than vanity. She is thinking, I am tired of being measured. The salon offers a counter-miracle, a room where the measuring is done differently, where anxiety is converted into a transaction. A transaction feels cleaner than pleading. The language of the salon is always careful. It doesn't call itself a con. It calls itself a science, a method, a discovery, an art. It borrows the vocabulary of modernity, treatments, preparations, processes, while also borrowing the older vocabulary of faith, transformation, renewal, youth restored. The beauty industry has always lived in that overlap between laboratory and chapel. Madame Rachel understood the overlap instinctively. Her promise was too large to be sensible, but it was not designed for sensible people. It was designed for the quietly desperate, the woman with a husband whose attention wandered, the woman whose social position depended on appearances, the woman whose name was secure only as long as she looked the part. It was designed for the peculiar Victorian fear of becoming old in public. Old, in this context, meant vulnerable. A salon can feel like sanctuary. It can also be a ledger. The door that admits you also records you. The hand that applies a cream can also assess what you will pay to avoid humiliation. The soothing voice can also be learning your secrets. In a world where reputation functions like property, a secret is not just personal. It is an asset. An asset can be traded. This is where the beauty story shifts into true crime. Because the offense is not only fraud in the crude sense, money exchanged for false promises. The deeper offense is leverage created through intimacy. A beauty salon is an intimate space. It invites confession under the guise of self-improvement. It encourages women to talk about what they fear, because fear is what keeps them returning. And return is what makes the operator powerful. Power in a salon does not look like a weapon. It looks like a routine: appointments, receipts, private rooms, familiar hands, a sense of being known. Being known feels comforting until it stops being voluntary. Then known becomes held. Held is where the trap begins. Madame Rachel's clients did not arrive in a single dramatic wave. They arrived the way markets grow, one recommendation at a time, one whispered name passed along the social chain. A woman hears of a miracle and thinks she is too sensible to believe it, until she catches her reflection at the wrong angle. Until a friend's tone changes. Until a husband's compliment lands like a reminder. Until the world looks suddenly sharp and merciless. And then she goes. She tells herself it is only a cream. Only a treatment. Only a visit. London is full of onlys. They are the words people use when they are stepping across a line they don't want to name. Inside the salon, the line is made to feel ordinary. The chair is comfortable. The room is warm. The products have names that sound scientific or exotic enough to imply authority. The operator speaks with certainty. Certainty is what clients are buying. Certainty that something can be done. Certainty that the decline they fear is negotiable. Certainty that their private panic has a solution that won't become public. Publicness is the threat beneath every purchase. And that threat is what turns a beauty entrepreneur into a figure of danger. Not because she is supernatural, but because she operates in the thin place where private shame can be converted into money and silence can be converted into control. Bond Street made her plausible. It wrapped the promise in prestige. It gave the lie a respectable address. The women who went there were not stupid. They were simply living inside a system that punished them for being human. Madame Rachel learned to sell the one thing that system withheld, the feeling that a woman could fight back against time without being seen to fight at all. The fight, however, always leaves a record. And eventually, the record becomes louder than the promise. Chapter 2: The Promise. Promises like this are never sold as lies. They are sold as inevitabilities. A woman does not hand over money for something she believes is false. She hands it over because she believes the promise might be true, or because she needs it to be true, or because the cost of refusing the promise feels higher than the cost of trying it. This is the quiet arithmetic behind most fraud, not stupidity, but pressure. In Victorian London, pressure had a face. It looked back from mirrors in gaslit rooms. It looked back from carriage windows and shop glass. It looked back from the expressions of other women, polite, assessing, trained to notice tiny changes. It looked back from men who spoke about beauty as if it were a woman's duty, and about aging as if it were a kind of negligence. Negligence, in this world, was punishable. Not in court, but in invitation lists and in attention that cooled. The promise Madame Rachel sold was simple enough to be repeated and grand enough to be irresistible, beautiful forever. It had the rhythm of a prayer and the confidence of a scientific claim. It didn't ask a woman to accept improvement. It offered permanence. That is the real seduction. Improvement still admits time. Permanence denies it. Denying time is what makes a person feel powerful. The salon could not sell power openly. Power in women was treated as suspect. So it sold treatment. Treatment sounds respectable. It sounds medical. It suggests an authority beyond vanity. The client becomes not a woman chasing youth, but a woman receiving care. Care is a language that makes desperation presentable. It allows a woman to want without appearing needy, to fear without appearing weak, to spend without appearing frivolous. Respectability is often just careful wording. The promise also had to feel exclusive. A miracle offered to everyone is less believable than a miracle offered behind a door. Bond Street supplied that door. The address itself was part of the product. A woman could tell herself she was not dabbling in crude quackery, she was engaging with a fashionable method in a fashionable place. In the Victorian imagination, social class could sanitize almost anything, even a fantasy. Inside, the promise would be made tactile. This is how these businesses work. They do not rely only on language. They rely on ritual. A woman is received, spoken to, assessed. She is sat down. Her face is examined with a seriousness that resembles professional attention. The operator speaks in the calm tone of expertise. The products are presented as if they have provenance, rare ingredients, imported secrets, knowledge unavailable to the ordinary. The client is made to feel chosen. Chosen people believe more easily. Then comes the crucial step, the problem is defined. A line is pointed out. A faint sag. A dullness in the skin. The client may not have noticed it until that moment, but once it is named it becomes real. Naming creates urgency. Urgency produces purchase. A woman might arrive with a general dread of aging and leave with a specific flaw she cannot unsee. This is the promise turning into need. Need is the engine that drives return visits. The treatments themselves do not have to perform miracles. They only have to perform care. Warm cloths, scented preparations, careful hands. The sensation of being attended to. The sense that something is being done. A woman can leave feeling altered simply because she has been handled with intention. Intention can feel like transformation when the alternative is feeling helpless. Helplessness is what the client has been fleeing. The promise is also reinforced through community, quietly, carefully. No respectable woman wants to admit she is frightened of aging, but respectable women will happily exchange recommendations. A name is passed along as a secret. The secrecy makes it feel safe. It also makes it feel true. People assume that if something is whispered rather than advertised, it must have substance. The whisper is taken as evidence of authenticity. Authenticity is one of the easiest things to counterfeit. All that is required is confidence and a little theater. Madame Rachel's theater was designed for a specific audience, women who had been trained to conceal their needs. The salon offered them a controlled space to acknowledge what they could not say elsewhere. In that space, shame was not abolished, it was managed. The client did not have to confess everything. She only had to confess enough to make the service feel tailored. Tailoring is what turns a product into a relationship. Once a relationship forms, the promise deepens. A cream can be dismissed. A person who understands you is harder to dismiss. The operator learns a client's rhythms, what she fears, what she can afford, what she won't admit, what she will do to avoid disgrace. The operator becomes part of the client's self-maintenance. In a world where women were taught to maintain themselves largely alone, that intimacy can feel like rescue. Rescue is another word for dependency. And dependency is where the promise changes character. At first, the promise is about beauty. Then it becomes about control. A woman returns because she believes she is investing in her future. She returns because the salon has become part of her routine. She returns because she is frightened of stopping and losing progress. She returns because she has told herself a story in which this is rational. She returns because she has already spent enough that she needs it to work. This is the slow tightening. Over time, the promise expands to fit whatever the client most needs. Not only youth, but confidence. Not only confidence, but safety. Not only safety, but social security. The beauty promise becomes a promise about life itself, that things can be held in place if the right method is followed, if the right money is paid, if the right door is used. A door used often becomes a liability. Because visits create patterns. Patterns create witnesses. Witnesses create vulnerability. And vulnerability is a currency the operator can spend. This is the part respectable clients do not anticipate when they first cross the threshold. They believe they are purchasing discretion. They do not always realize that discretion is also something that can be withheld. The salon knows where you have been. The salon knows what you asked for. The salon knows the face you presented when you were afraid. The salon knows what you will do to keep that fear from becoming public knowledge. The promise begins as a product and ends as leverage. This is how a beauty business becomes a true crime story without changing its outward appearance. The jars remain on the shelf. The chair remains comfortable. The hands remain gentle. What shifts is the balance of power. The client's private need becomes a handle. A handle can be pulled. And in a city where reputation is everything, a handle is more dangerous than a weapon. Because it doesn't have to spill blood. It only has to spill a name. Chapter 3: The Clients. It is tempting to imagine that women who paid for miracles were foolish. Victorian London made that temptation easy. It liked its lessons tidy, vanity punished, virtue rewarded, the gullible exposed. But tidy lessons belong to pamphlets, not to real lives. The women who went to Madame Rachel did not arrive as caricatures. They arrived as people who understood the rules of their world too well. The rules were cruel, and they were specific. A woman's social position could be steadied or shaken by details so small they barely counted as events: a whisper about her husband's attention, a glance exchanged across a drawing room, an invitation that failed to arrive. Beauty was not simply decoration in this system. It was a kind of currency, spent to purchase patience, admiration, tolerance, even safety. When that currency began to decline, a woman felt it in ways that did not need to be announced. The decline was public long before it was spoken. For many clients, the salon was not a frivolity. It was a strategy. The first category were the women who understood themselves as precarious. Not necessarily poor, but dependent, on husbands, on allowances, on the mood of families who could withdraw support. In a world where a woman's independence was often a polite myth, dependency created a constant, low-level fear. Anything that threatened her desirability, age, illness, gossip, threatened her material stability. Youth was not only about looking pretty. It was about looking safe to keep. Those clients did not want to be admired. They wanted to remain unreplaceable. The second category were the women who were ambitious. They wanted entry, or more entry. They wanted a better marriage, a higher circle, a closer seat to influence. London's social ladders were polished and slippery. A woman could climb them, but every rung demanded performance. The performance was not only manners. It was appearance, freshness, refinement, the look of effortless ease. The salon promised a tool for climbing, a way to look like one belonged. Belonging is one of the most expensive things a person can purchase. The third category were the women who were frightened of their own visibility. They were the ones whose lives already contained a quiet scandal, a lover, a debt, a marriage cracking at the edges. They were watched more closely because they had something to lose. For them, the salon's private rooms offered more than creams. It offered the feeling of being handled gently when the rest of life felt harsh. It offered a space where fear could be named without consequence, at least at first. At first is where so many stories begin. There were also women who came for reasons that had little to do with men. Aging can feel like mourning even without a husband's gaze. In an era that framed women's value as a narrowing window, the approach of age could feel like the approach of erasure. A woman might want to hold her face in place because she wanted to hold her identity in place. She might want to remain recognizable to herself. This kind of longing is not laughable. It is simply human, made sharper by the era's rules. The salon, however, did not treat clients as a collection of human longings. It treated them as profiles. That profiling did not require a ledger of names. It required attention. The operator learned quickly which clients would pay for comfort, which would pay for exclusivity, which would pay for secrecy. She learned who wanted reassurance and who wanted transformation. She learned who needed to feel superior to other women even while purchasing the same promise. The beauty market thrives on comparison. So it manufactures it. A client would be made to believe she was not like the others. She was finer, more sensitive, more deserving of special care. She was the kind of woman a practitioner enjoyed helping. This flattery worked because it soothed the shame of being there. Shame is what respectable clients bring into a salon like this. They cannot admit, even to themselves, that they are afraid. So the salon reframes fear as refinement. Refinement is fear in better clothing. Then there is the matter of payment. The prices in such businesses are rarely incidental. They are part of the spell. High costs do not simply enrich the operator. They signal seriousness. They make the client commit. A woman who pays a large sum is more likely to believe she has purchased something real, because disbelief would mean admitting she has been fooled. People defend their expenses with faith. Faith becomes the lock on the door. Once a client has crossed the threshold and paid the first sum, she has created a secret. Even if the treatment is harmless, even if the promise is obviously inflated, the visit itself becomes an uncomfortable fact. Respectable women did not like to be seen as desperate, and desperation is what these establishments quietly trade in. A secret does not have to be scandalous to be powerful. It only has to be unwanted. This is the soil where leverage grows. A woman might not fear exposure because she has done something immoral, but because exposure would make her ridiculous. Ridicule is not minor in a society built on reputation. Ridicule corrodes. It invites cruelty. It signals weakness. A woman who is ridiculed becomes easier to ignore, easier to mistreat, easier to replace. So she protects her secret. And in protecting it, she becomes easier to control. Clients rarely understand this at the beginning, because the salon does not introduce itself as a trap. It introduces itself as a refuge. The operator is warm. She remembers names. She makes sympathetic sounds at the right moments. She speaks as if she is on the client's side against the world's harsh judgment. This is the intimacy that creates dependence. The client feels seen in a way she cannot feel elsewhere. The client begins to return not only for the treatment, but for the sensation of being taken seriously. To be taken seriously is a powerful drug. As the relationship deepens, the salon begins to occupy a peculiar place in a client's life. It is both indulgence and necessity, both shameful and soothing, both private and increasingly risky. The client may tell herself she can stop at any time, and then discover that stopping feels like stepping into cold air without a coat. This is how the boundary shifts. The salon becomes a place where a woman's fear is managed for her, and management begins to look like control. The operator can suggest more visits, more products, more necessary stages. She can imply that progress will be lost. She can hint that certain women who stopped too soon suffered consequences, wrinkles returning, husbands wandering, a collapse of the complexion that sounds like a warning from a priest. Warnings keep customers loyal. The most dangerous clients, however, are the ones who begin to resist. A woman who questions the costs, who hesitates, who complains, who threatens to leave, she is a threat to the salon's stability. She is also, in a system built on secrecy, vulnerable in a new way. She has admitted too much to retreat cleanly. This is when the client learns the true value of her own privacy. She learns that privacy is not simply something she possesses. It is something she negotiates. And negotiation is rarely equal. In the end, the clients are not merely the background to Madame Rachel's story. They are the engine. Their fear keeps the door open. Their money keeps the promise alive. Their respectability gives the business its camouflage. Their silence provides the operating space. Without them, the salon is just jars on shelves and a sign on a fashionable street. With them, it becomes something else entirely, a private economy of shame and hope, where beauty is the excuse and control is the product. By the time the scandal breaks, it will be easy to frame these women as foolish. But that framing is another kind of cruelty, because it refuses to name what was actually sold to them. Not youth. Not beauty. Permission to feel safe. Chapter 4. The Leverage. Leverage rarely arrives as a threat. It arrives as familiarity. A client returns for the second visit and the third, and the salon begins to feel less like a shop and more like a private arrangement. Names are remembered. Preferences are noted. Small details are held and repeated back with the soft competence that reads as care. The operator's voice becomes a constant in a client's life, steady, sympathetic, certain. Certainty is what the client has been buying all along. In a city like London, certainty is seductive because it is scarce. Respectability looks solid from the outside, but it is always shifting underneath. Marriages are negotiated performances. Friendships are alliances in silk. Money disappears. Affection cools. A woman can do everything right and still be discarded. The pressure to appear untroubled in such a world is immense. A salon that offers a controlled space, one where a woman can admit fear without consequences, begins to function like a confessional. The confessional is not neutral ground. A beauty operator does not need a crime to occur to hold power. Power is created the moment a client becomes invested in secrecy. A woman might not fear discovery because she has committed a moral offense, but because discovery would change how she is seen. Ridicule would do the work that law does not have to. It would mock her as desperate. It would make her easier to dismiss. Dismissal is the real social punishment. The salon understands this without ever stating it. It doesn't say, "I can ruin you." It says, "I understand you." It says, "Other people are cruel, I am on your side." It says, "You deserve better." It creates an us against the world. That us feels like safety. It also creates dependency. Dependency makes leverage possible. At first, the leverage is gentle. A suggestion that the next phase is essential. A hint that stopping now would waste what has already been paid for. A reminder that other clients who followed the program saw remarkable improvement. The language is soft, but the intent is firm: return, pay, continue. This is the ordinary mechanism of commerce. It becomes something darker when a client tries to exit. There is always a moment when the client's internal arithmetic changes. She looks at the sums she has paid. She notices that the promised miracle has become merely maintenance. She hears herself repeating the salon's assurances to a friend and realizes how thin they sound. She watches a husband's eyes drift anyway. Or she simply becomes tired of chasing, tired of hoping, tired of paying for a future she cannot guarantee. Tired clients are dangerous to the operator. Not because they are inherently powerful, but because they are unpredictable. A tired client might complain. She might refuse payment. She might speak to a friend with less discretion. She might reach for official help. She might do the one thing the business cannot survive. She might make the arrangement public. Publicness is where the salon loses control. So control is tightened before that happens. The operator has tools. They do not look like tools. They look like knowledge: a client's visits, her worries, what she said when she was upset, what she admitted when she believed the room was safe. The operator also has something else: an understanding of the client's social world. She knows what the client fears would happen if certain details were repeated elsewhere. Fear makes an excellent lock. And fear can be handled with care. A skillful operator doesn't have to invent much. She only has to imply that she is not entirely alone in holding the secret. She can hint that servants saw the client enter. She can mention casually that certain people on the street are always watching. She can note that London is a small world. She can smile at the right moment and let the client's imagination do the rest. Imagination is often more brutal than a direct threat. Sometimes the leverage is financial. Costs rise in stages, framed as necessity: a rarer preparation, an urgent correction, an exclusive method now required because the client's case is unusual. The client is told she is special. Special cases cost more. The client pays partly to preserve hope, and partly to preserve dignity, because refusing feels like admitting she has been taken in. Pride keeps people trapped as effectively as fear. Sometimes the leverage is moral. The operator can frame the client as ungrateful, as disloyal, as a woman who wants miracles without commitment. The client is reminded of how much effort has been expended on her. She is made to feel responsible for the relationship. This is subtle, and it is effective. Many women have been trained to carry responsibility even when they are being manipulated. Responsibility is one of the easiest weights to hang on a client. And then there is the sharpest form of leverage. Not payment, not guilt, but reputational threat, the implication that the client's privacy can be open to the world. In Victorian London, a woman's reputation was not only social. It was practical. It determined her access to protection, to community, to resources. To be mocked or suspected was to become exposed. Exposure created vulnerability to further harm. It also created a kind of loneliness that could be fatal in a society where women were expected to survive through networks. The operator knows this. She doesn't need to say, "I will ruin you." She only needs to make the client believe that ruin is possible. At this point, the salon has changed. It is still warm and perfumed and politely arranged, but its function is different. It is no longer simply a place where a woman purchases a product. It is a place where a woman is managed, where her fear is regulated and her choices narrowed. Narrowing is what coercion looks like when it is disguised as care. The client may not even name it. She may tell herself that she is continuing because she wants the treatment to work, because she has invested so much, because she can stop whenever she likes. But her behavior tells the truth. She returns despite frustration, she pays despite doubt, she keeps the arrangement private despite its cost. She is acting like someone protecting herself from something. Protection becomes indistinguishable from captivity. This is how a beauty scandal shifts into the texture of true crime. The crime is not always a single dramatic act. It is the slow conversion of intimacy into control. The client comes for a cream. She stays because she is being held. And the operator learns something that Victorian London teaches with ruthless clarity, that the most valuable commodity is not youth, not beauty, not even money. It is silence. Chapter 5. The Complaints. A fraud does not collapse because it is false. It collapses because someone stops agreeing to keep it private. Most clients endure disappointment quietly. They tell themselves they misunderstood. They adjust their expectations downwards. They decide the treatment is subtle or gradual or maintenance. They repeat the operator's language until it sounds like their own. This is not because they are weak. It is because they are trying to preserve dignity in a world that punishes women for wanting too much. Dignity is expensive, and many women pay for it with silence. But silence has limits. A client reaches the edge when the sums become impossible to justify, or when the promise begins to feel like mockery. She reaches it when the operator's warmth turns conditional, when reassurance becomes instruction, when the treatment's next step keeps arriving like a bill. She reaches it when she realizes she is not being helped but managed. Realizing that is a kind of humiliation. Humiliation is unstable. It creates anger, and anger is dangerous to a business built on discretion. The first complaints are rarely formal. They appear as small rebellions, missed appointments, delayed payments, sudden illness used as excuse, the polite withdrawal of a client who does not want confrontation. A woman may stop coming and hope the story ends there. She may tell herself that leaving quietly is safer than arguing. She may be right. But a quiet exit does not always stay quiet. A client leaves and then hears that others are still going, still paying, still repeating the same hopeful phrases. That can provoke a new kind of pressure, the fear of being the only one fooled, the fear of being the one left behind while others climb. Shame again. Does the operator's work for her? Shame is an excellent stabilizer. Until it isn't. Because shame can flip into indignation. A woman who feels she has been exploited may begin to crave not only her money back but a restoration of status. She wants to reframe herself from gullible to wronged. This reframing is crucial. A victim can complain without losing dignity. A fool cannot. So she searches for a way to be a victim. Victimhood becomes a route back to respectability. In Victorian London, however, complaint is not simple. To complain is to speak publicly about what was meant to remain private. A woman has to decide which is worse, the continued loss, or the risk of exposure. She has to decide whether official systems will protect her or punish her. She has to calculate whether her husband will support her or use her admission as proof of weakness. She has to decide whether she can endure the look on another person's face when she says, out loud, I believed it. That look is often harsher than any court. This is why complaints tend to begin sideways. A woman tests the story on a friend, carefully. She offers it as gossip rather than confession. Have you heard of this place? She watches the friend's reaction. If the friend leans in, the woman feels less alone. If the friend recoils, the woman retreats into silence again. Networks do not simply spread scandal, they determine whether scandal is survivable. Survivable scandal is the kind that becomes public. And once a complaint becomes public, it begins to take on weight. A single dissatisfied client is easy to dismiss, hysterical, unreasonable, impatient. The operator can frame her as difficult, as someone who refused to follow the program, as someone whose expectations were unrealistic. This framing is especially effective in a culture already inclined to treat women as emotionally unreliable. The client is punished for speaking. That punishment is part of the deterrent. But when multiple complaints appear, the framing becomes harder to hold. Women begin to compare notes. Comparison creates pattern. Pattern creates the sense of being wronged collectively rather than individually. Collective wrong is what authorities can act on, because collective wrong produces noise, and noise threatens the public order. Public order is what the state protects first. A beauty business can continue to operate as long as it stays within the category of private foolishness. Once it becomes a public nuisance, or once it begins to brush against the reputations of respectable people, it becomes a different kind of problem. Not because the state suddenly cares about women being deceived, but because women being deceived can become politically inconvenient. The operator understands this too. So she treats complaints as threats to be managed. Some complainants are soothed. They are offered partial refunds, new treatments, new promises. They are made to feel special again. The goal is not to satisfy them but to quiet them. Quiet is cheaper than justice. Other complainants are pressured. This pressure can be subtle, reminders of discretion, hints about how the world would interpret their visits, suggestions that certain people might be interested to hear what they have been doing. The complainant is made to understand that complaint is not a neutral act. It is a trade. Speak, and you may lose more than money. The operator does not need to be explicit. The era does the threatening for her. A woman who admits she sought youth behind a private door risks being framed as vain, immoral, unstable, ridiculous. Ridicule can ruin as effectively as criminal charges. London's most dangerous weapon is not the knife. It is the story told in the right rooms. The operator's power lies in her proximity to those rooms. Even if she cannot enter them openly, she can send whispers into them. And that possibility is enough. So many clients remain silent, and the business continues. Until a different kind of client complains. Not merely a frightened woman guarding her dignity, but a woman who has leverage of her own, wealth, a furious husband, a connection, a solicitor, a stubbornness that refuses to be softened. A client who will not accept quietness as the price of survival. That is when the case becomes visible. Visibility changes the balance of power. Once a formal complaint exists, once a letter is written, once a lawyer is engaged, once a magistrate becomes aware, the salon is no longer only a private theater. It is now a public question. The operator's confidence begins to work against her, because confidence can look like deceit when placed under law's cold attention. Law, however, does not arrive gently. It arrives in categories. It will not be interested in a woman's social fear, or the cruelty of a culture that treated aging as failure. It will be interested in sums of money, statements made, promises offered, items delivered. It will be interested in whether a transaction can be described as fraudulent in terms the court recognizes. The court prefers numbers to feelings. This is where clients are forced into a second humiliation. They must tell their stories in a language that strips away their original reasons for going. They must translate private dread into legal complaint. They must reduce their fear to figures and receipts. They must risk being mocked in public so they can reclaim what they lost in private. Some will do it. Some will not. Those who do are the ones who break the spell. Not because the spell was powerful in itself, but because it relied on collective cooperation, a city agreeing not to look too closely, and clients agreeing not to speak too loudly. A complaint is the sound of that agreement cracking. And once it cracks, the promise that held the salon together, beautiful forever, begins to look less like hope and more like evidence. Chapter 6. The Old Bailey. A private fraud becomes a public case when the public can be made to look without blushing. That is the quiet threshold the law waits for. It does not rush to defend every deceived woman. It moves when reputations are at risk, when money becomes large enough to look criminal, when the story becomes too noisy to ignore. Madame Rachel's salon was built on discretion, but discretion is fragile. Once a complaint enters official hands, the salon stops being a private embarrassment and becomes a spectacle the city can consume. The Old Bailey is not merely a building in this story. It is a mouth. It takes private life and speaks it aloud. In September 1868, Madame Rachel's case was tried at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, across 4 days, 22 to September 25, a timetable that already hints at attention and appetite. The case did not arrive as a philosophical question about beauty culture. It arrived as a practical charge: money taken, promises made, deception alleged. The court would treat the salon less as sanctuary than as enterprise. Enterprise is legible to law. Female fear is not. This is part of the cruelty. For a woman to appear in court and admit she paid to be beautiful forever is to offer herself up to a particular Victorian pleasure, the pleasure of judging women. The witness is asked to describe what she bought, what she believed, what she hoped for. Every answer risks sounding ridiculous. The defense does not need to prove she is immoral, it only needs to suggest she is vain, foolish, unstable. The era supplies the sneer. Even the phrase above the salon door becomes evidence. Beautiful forever is not only marketing, it is a commitment to the impossible, nailed into public view on Bond Street, daring the city to laugh, and daring it too to envy. Once the case reaches court, that phrase loses its glamour. It becomes a hook the prosecution can hang a simple argument on. No reasonable person could deliver this promise, therefore the promise itself implies deceit. Law likes arguments that fit on a single nail. The trial pulled the salon out into daylight. A place described as private and indulgent is redescribed as calculated and predatory. The objects that once signaled luxury, jars, tonics, exotic names, are repositioned as stage props. Even the famous magnetic rock dew is no longer merely odd, it becomes part of a pattern, expensive preparations marketed with authority and mystique to extract money from anxious clients. The court doesn't need to believe in the product to convict the seller. It only needs to believe in the intent. And intent is made from narrative, repeated visits, escalating costs, the language of exclusivity, the insistence that more payment is necessary to preserve progress. The prosecution's job is to translate a relationship, intimate, shame-laced, half-confessional, into a straightforward structure of exploitation. That translation is easier once the public has decided what kind of woman Madame Rachel is allowed to be. Allowed is the word that matters. A woman who sells youth is already suspicious in a culture that insists women must be modest about wanting anything. When that woman is accused of fraud, the suspicion becomes permission. Permission for the newspapers to linger. Permission for audiences to flock. Permission for the court to treat the salon's private world as a kind of moral theatre. Victorian London loved theatre when it came with punishment. The trial also does something else. It forces clients to become witnesses against themselves. A respectable woman must explain how she came to that door, how she handed money over, how she returned again. She must expose the structure of her fear in a room that will not treat fear kindly. Her evidence may convict the operator, but it also stains her. This is why so many cases like this depend on a particular kind of witness, someone either angry enough or protected enough to endure the humiliation of being heard. Humiliation is the price of public truth. Madame Rachel's address, repeated in accounts, becomes part of the fascination. 47A, New Bond Street, a precise point where prestige and deception meet. The very specificity of it makes the scandal sharper. It suggests that fraud did not operate in shadowy alleys. It operated behind glass on a fashionable street. It suggests that the respectable walked into it willingly. Willingness is what the public most enjoys condemning. But condemnation is also a defense. If the clients are silly, then the system that made them desperate stays unexamined. If the operator is simply a wicked woman, then the economy that rewarded her stays intact. The Old Bailey can deliver a verdict, but it cannot deliver a social reckoning. It can declare one person guilty and allow everyone else to return to their lives with a comfortable belief that the danger has been located and removed. A verdict functions like a closing door. Outside the court, the story begins to harden. It becomes less about transactions and more about character. The con woman, the gullible ladies, the exotic boudoir, the shocking sums. It becomes a moral tale about vanity, because vanity is safer to condemn than the structural reality that beauty functioned as social insurance for women with limited legal power. The court gives the city its favorite kind of ending. Not understanding. An example. And once an example exists, the scandal can move from happening to remembered. The remembered version is always tidier than the truth. Chapter 7, The Verdict. The court does not only decide what happened. It decides what can be said about what happened. By the time a case reaches the Old Bailey, the story has already been reduced. A salon becomes a business. A relationship becomes a transaction. Private fear becomes inducement. Shame becomes motive. The law prefers clean lines, and the public prefers them too. Clean lines make it easier to point and say, there. That was the problem. The verdict is the moment the pointing becomes official. A woman like Madame Rachel is not judged only on evidence. She is judged on what she represents. Victorian London had a particular suspicion of women who handled desire as commerce. A woman selling youth did not fit comfortably inside respectable categories. She stood too close to performance, too close to appetite, too close to the idea that a woman could manipulate the rules rather than submit to them. The case is framed as fraud, but it is haunted by moral discomfort. The court cannot admit that discomfort as such, so it expresses it through certainty. It speaks of deception and money and promises that cannot be kept. It positions the operator as calculating and the clients as misled. This is a useful distribution of agency. It preserves the client's respectability by allowing them to be victims rather than participants in their own desperation. Victims can return to society. Participants are harder to forgive. The verdict also serves the city's need for an ending that feels righteous. London wanted to believe it was not the kind of place where people could purchase miracles in public. It wanted to believe Bond Street was above that. It wanted to believe the fashionable were too sensible to be seduced by claims that belonged, supposedly, to cheap pamphlets and back-alley quacks. The trial makes that belief possible again. A guilty verdict transforms the entire story into a lesson about deviance, a woman who stepped too far outside her place and was punished for it. It allows the city to treat the salon as an aberration rather than as a business that thrived because it met a real need. Need is what the verdict cannot convict. It can convict methods. It can convict language. It can convict the act of selling certainty to people who are frightened. But it cannot convict the conditions that create frightened customers. For clients, the verdict is complicated relief. Relief because the operator is stopped, and because the public can focus its judgment on her rather than on them. Relief because the story is now officially about fraud, not about the private humiliations that drew them to the door. But the relief is mixed with a quieter discomfort, the knowledge that their own fears were turned into evidence. They will not forget what it felt like to be heard. The court has taken the secrecy they paid for and made it part of the public record. Even if their names are not repeated everywhere, the shape of their desire has been exposed. They have been made legible in a way respectable women rarely consent to, as aging bodies, anxious bodies, bargaining bodies. The verdict does not restore the old privacy. It only closes the case. And closing the case restores the city's rhythm. The newspapers can move on. The crowd can find a new spectacle. The court can return to its normal work. London can tell itself that it has dealt with the problem. A single woman can be treated as the source of embarrassment, and therefore as the solution. That is the function of a public conviction, to concentrate shame. Concentrated shame is manageable. Diffuse shame is dangerous. But the market that produced Madame Rachel does not vanish. It adapts. In the wake of a scandal, beauty does not become less valuable. If anything, the fear sharpens. Women do not stop being assessed. Time does not stop being treated as a threat. The desire to remain safe inside a brutal social system does not dissolve because a salon is closed. It simply becomes quieter. A different address. A different name. A different promise worded more carefully. This is why the verdict feels satisfying and incomplete at once. It satisfies the public's appetite for punishment. It satisfies the law's preference for clear categories. It satisfies the city's need to stop looking at what made the fraud possible. And it leaves untouched the machinery that created the clientele, a culture that demanded women remain desirable while denying them the right to admit how much that demand cost. Madame Rachel becomes a warning story, not only about deception, but about visibility. A warning to operators, do not grow too bold. A warning to clients, do not leave trails. A warning to respectable women, keep your desperation private. London is good at warnings. It has always preferred warnings to repair. So the verdict lands, the door closes, and the city continues, still watched, still measuring, still hungry for the illusion that beauty can be made into certainty. The promise dies in court. The need survives in the street. Chapter 8, The Sentence. A verdict tells the city what to think. A sentence tells it what to feel. The punishment has to match the story that has been built. If the punishment is too small, the public reads weakness. If it is too large, the public reads unease, an awareness that the offense was not only fraud, but something the city cannot comfortably name. The sentence is where the court attempts balance, justice performed loudly enough to reassure, but not so loudly that it invites deeper questions. The difficulty is that deeper questions cling to a case like this. Because the harm is not limited to money. Money is what the court can measure, but the salon trafficked in something else as well: humiliation, dependence, secrecy, the slow theft of a woman's confidence in her own judgment. That harm does not fit neatly into a ledger, and so the state deals with what it can: receipts, promises, sums. The sentence punishes the transaction. It leaves the emotional economy untouched. For Madame Rachel, sentencing is the moment she is finally stripped of the glamour that made her plausible. Outside the courtroom she could be an authority. Inside it she becomes an object. Her confidence, which once functioned as proof of expertise, is reinterpreted as proof of calculation. The very skills that built her business, reading people, shaping language, managing impressions, are used against her as evidence of intent. Intent is the hinge on which punishment swings. A person who is convicted of fraud is not punished for failure. She is punished for meaning to take. The sentence therefore arrives as a moral verdict as much as a legal one. It declares that the operator knew what she was doing. It declares that the client's hopes were not merely disappointed but exploited. It declares that the salon was not simply foolishness, but predation dressed as refinement. The city needs that declaration. It needs to believe that what happened was not a reflection of its own cruelty, but the work of a particular kind of person, an operator who took advantage of the vulnerable. The sentence supplies a clean boundary between respectable London and the thing it wants to cast out. Boundaries are built from bodies. A sentence also communicates to other women who might be tempted to operate in similar spaces. It says, do not be so visible. Do not be so ambitious. Do not place your enterprise in a fashionable address where it can embarrass the respectable. Do not build a business on the private fears of the well-connected unless you can guarantee their silence. It is not only a punishment. It is instruction. Instruction is a form of control. For clients, the sentence does not restore what they truly wanted. They may recover money, or they may not. They may regain some sense of dignity by telling themselves they helped to stop the operator. But they do not regain the confidence that the world can be negotiated safely. They have learned that their private fear can be dragged into public view. They have learned that what feels like a refuge can become a record. They have also learned something more uncomfortable, that they were willing to bargain for a promise that could not be kept. This does not make them foolish. It makes them human inside a system that demands the impossible and punishes those who admit they are trying. When the sentence is spoken, the city receives what it came for. An ending. An ending is a kind of release. It allows gossip to settle into a story. It allows moral judgment to be applied without effort. It allows the public to stop asking questions and return to the business of watching one another in smaller, more ordinary ways. That return is the real victory of the legal system. Not merely the removal of one operator, but the restoration of routine. Routine is what protects hierarchies. Routine keeps women measuring themselves quietly rather than speaking openly about what the measuring does to them. Routine keeps shame individual rather than shared. Routine keeps the beauty market alive, because the beauty market feeds on private dissatisfaction. A scandal can briefly illuminate that economy, but the sentence draws the curtain. And once the curtain falls, London resumes its preferred posture. It pretends the problem has been solved. In reality, it has only been relocated. The operator becomes a warning. The clients become a cautionary murmur. The address becomes a story people tell each other with a mixture of amusement and discomfort. And the need that drove women to that door, fear of being judged, fear of being replaced, fear of becoming less protected, continues to shape choices in quieter rooms. The sentence ends the case. It does not end the market. It does not end the cruelty. It does not end the longing that made beautiful forever sound like a possible bargain. It simply teaches everyone involved what the city always teaches in the end. Keep it discreet. Keep it deniable. Keep it out of court. Chapter 9. The Afterlife. A scandal does not end when the court is finished speaking. It ends when the city decides it has absorbed enough embarrassment to look away again. London is skilled at looking away. It does it with speed. It does it with replacement stories. It does it by turning discomfort into entertainment and then treating entertainment as proof that the danger was never truly close. Once the sentence has been delivered, the case becomes portable. It can be repeated in drawing rooms as a cautionary anecdote, told with a smile that says how extraordinary, while carefully avoiding the quieter admission beneath it, how familiar. Familiarity is what makes a fraud dangerous. Not the novelty of it, but its fit. Madame Rachel's story settles quickly into the shape Victorian culture prefers for women: rise through performance, fall through exposure. The operator becomes a type, not a person. She becomes the adventuress, the imposter, the woman who dared to handle respectable fears as commerce. The details that would complicate the moral are sanded down. Complexity is inconvenient when a city is trying to recover its poise. Poise is the chief Victorian virtue. The clients, meanwhile, are erased in a particular way. They are not forgotten entirely. They remain as a soft collective joke, ladies with money and anxieties, ladies silly enough to believe in miracles. This is how the city protects them and punishes them at once. It does not print their entire lives on the page, but it allows their fear to be ridiculed. It turns their private panic into public amusement. Amusement is a form of discipline. It teaches other women what not to admit. If you admit you fear age, you can be mocked. If you admit you have paid to stave it off, you can be shamed. If you admit you were held in a private arrangement you could not easily exit, you can be blamed for walking into it. So women learn what London always teaches: keep your desperation elegant, and keep it quiet. Quiet desperation sustains the market better than any advertisement. After the case, other operators do not vanish. They adapt. They learn that visibility is risk. They shift addresses. They moderate their promises. They borrow new language, more medical, more modern, less theatrical. They learn how to make the same offer without making it so easy to prosecute, not beautiful forever, but restored, refreshed, improved. They learn to describe a miracle as a course. Language is how the market hides. The beauty industry is not born from Madame Rachel, but her scandal becomes a marker in its history, a moment when the private economy of female fear becomes too public and is punished. The punishment does not destroy the economy. It polishes it. It pushes it into forms that appear more respectable, more scientific, less vulnerable to ridicule. Respectability is the most valuable packaging. For the city, the afterlife of the case also performs a useful social function. It restores the idea that the law can handle the threat. A single operator is removed. A moral lesson is delivered. The street is cleansed. The newspapers move on. London tells itself a story in which it has corrected an aberration, but it has not corrected the system that made the aberration profitable. The system remains intact, women assessed constantly, aging treated as failure, safety tied to desirability, money traded for the illusion of control. This is why the afterlife is the most revealing part of the story. It shows what a society is willing to change and what it refuses to change. London was willing to punish a woman who embarrassed it. It was not willing to dismantle the machinery that made her business possible. In the years that follow, the name Madame Rachel becomes a kind of shorthand. A warning label attached to anyone selling promises too grand, too intimate, too expensive. The name is used to tell a story about fraud, but it is also used to police women's behavior, a reminder that the desire to be beautiful can be punished if it becomes visible in the wrong way. The warning is not only about being deceived. It is about being seen. Seen as vain. Seen as frightened. Seen as bargaining. Seen as a woman trying to do privately what she cannot do openly, negotiate her place in a world that measures her relentlessly. The afterlife, then, is not only hers. It belongs to the city, to the clients who learned to hide better, to the operators who learned to promise more carefully, to the readers who learned to laugh rather than recognize, and to the market which continues, quietly confidently, selling women the same old consolation, that with the right method, the right money, and the right discretion, time can be held at bay. Time cannot be held, but fear can be managed. And managing fear has always been profitable. Chapter 10, The Woman Behind the Name. The scandal fixes her in place as Madame Rachel, as if the title were the whole person. Titles are useful because they make a life portable. They allow a complex history to be carried in 2 words. They also allow the reader to avoid a harder truth, that behind the name was a woman who learned, step by step, how to survive in a city that offered women few clean paths to security. Survival is not an excuse. It is context. The record tends to treat her as if she appeared fully formed, already clever, already predatory, already certain of what she could take from other women. That is the convenience of scandal. It turns a person into an origin point. It implies that a single will created the whole situation. London rarely works that way. London makes people. It shapes them through hunger, through class, through the brutal grammar of who is allowed to be respectable and who must mimic it. A woman who could not inherit power could still learn to imitate it. She could learn the tones that open doors, the vocabulary that sounds educated, the posture that convinces. She could learn that many people are not deceived by facts, but by certainty delivered with the right manners. Manners are a kind of camouflage. The beauty trade offered a particularly effective disguise because it sat inside a social permission slip. Women were allowed to be concerned with their faces. They were allowed to talk about improvement. They were allowed to spend money on treatments if the spending could be framed as refinement rather than desperation. A woman running such a business could therefore place herself in rooms where other forms of commerce would have been inappropriate. The face becomes a passport. But a passport only works if it looks official. This is where the title matters. Madam is not simply a courtesy. It is authority implied. It suggests marriage, stability, foreignness softened into sophistication. It suggests a woman who is not merely selling, but presiding. It is an invented respectability that clients can borrow simply by entering her rooms. The title flatters them. If they are here, they must also be the sort of women who belong here. Belonging is the commodity under everything else. The scandal later paints her as a woman preying on the elite, but the truth beneath it is more awkward. She depended on the elite to make her plausible. Their money sustained her, and their fear protected her. As long as respectable clients remained silent, the business could continue. In that sense, her survival and theirs became entangled. Entanglement is what makes the case uncomfortable. It is easy to condemn a fraud that targets strangers. It is harder to condemn a fraud that thrives inside mutual secrecy. This is why her character became such a focus after the trial. If the city can frame her as uniquely wicked, it can avoid examining the collective arrangement that let her operate. It can avoid asking why so many women were prepared to pay to be held, and why so many were prepared to keep paying once they realized the promise was slipping. A wicked woman makes a better story than a cruel system. And yet the system can be glimpsed in the details the scandal cannot fully erase. A woman in Victorian London did not become a madam by accident. She learned the value of appearance because appearance was often the only defense she could carry. She learned that softness could be used as a tool. She learned that intimacy creates dependency, and dependency creates payment. She learned that women's shame is reliable currency because women are trained to protect their reputation even at their own expense. If she exploited that, she also relied on it. Reliance does not absolve exploitation. It simply shows how the market is built from human conditions rather than from pure malice. The case also reveals something else about her. She understood the violence of ridicule. Many criminals use force. She used story. She understood that the threat most of her clients feared was not physical harm but social unraveling. Their world could be dismantled without a hand laid on them, simply by the right information spoken in the wrong place. That is why her leverage was so effective. She held not weapons but knowledge, knowledge produced by the intimate ritual of care. Care is what made the extraction possible. The scandal's retellings often linger on the absurdity of the promise, beautiful forever, because absurdity makes condemnation easy. But the promise was not only absurd. It was precise. It targeted the ache at the center of the era's treatment of women, that a woman's value was both intensely public and terrifyingly fragile. Fragility makes people purchase certainty. And certainty is always for sale. In the end, the woman behind the name is not offered here as a sympathetic figure. She is offered as a reminder that true crime is not only about deviance. It is about markets. It is about the conversion of private fear into profit. It is about what a society makes possible, and then punishes once it becomes embarrassed. Madame Rachel is remembered because her case was dramatic. But what made it dramatic was not merely her. It was the crowd of respectable women behind her, women who came quietly, paid heavily, stayed silent, and then were forced into public speech when the silence finally broke. That crowd is where the story belongs. Because without that crowd, the name Madame Rachel is only a title. With it, the title becomes a mechanism. And mechanisms, once seen, are difficult to unsee. Chapter 11, The City That Wanted It. A scandal like this is often told as a contest between deceiver and deceived. That version is comfortable. It keeps the story small. It suggests that if one woman had been less cunning, or if a few clients had been more sensible, the whole thing would have dissolved quietly. It turns the case into a moral about personal weakness and personal wickedness. But the salon did not exist in a vacuum. It existed inside a city that wanted what it sold. London wanted youth the way it wanted respectability, intensely, publicly, and with the pretense that wanting did not exist. It wanted women to look fresh while also looking effortless. It wanted them to remain desirable while behaving as if desirability were beneath them. It wanted them to invest in their appearance and then deny the investment. The contradiction was not an accident. It was a method of control. A woman trapped inside contradictions learns to live by quiet bargains. She learns to do privately what she cannot defend publicly. That is where the beauty market thrives. It offers a place to perform the bargain without naming it. It offers a door that can be opened without leaving mud on the hem. Mud is what the era feared, evidence of need. Madame Rachel's salon made need look like refinement. That is why Bond Street mattered. Not merely as an address, but as a social alibi. A woman walking into a fashionable salon could tell herself she was not desperate. She was discerning. She was not vain. She was maintaining standards. The language of taste was used to disguise the language of fear. Fear is embarrassing. Taste is respectable. The city also wanted secrecy. Respectable London depended on it. It depended on concealed affairs, concealed debts, concealed illnesses, concealed cruelty inside polite marriages. It depended on the ability to keep an appearance intact while reality buckled underneath. The salon offered secrecy as a product. It told women, your private fear can be handled here, away from the eyes that judge you. And then it taught them a harsher truth. That secrecy is never simply possessed. It is always held by someone. Held secrecy becomes leverage. This is why the case is more than fraud. Fraud suggests a simple theft, money taken for false goods. But what happened here was a deeper exchange. Women offered their privacy and received a feeling in return. The feeling was hope. The feeling was control. The feeling was being looked after. The feeling was a temporary suspension of the city's harsh assessment. A feeling can be more valuable than a product. And it can be exploited more efficiently. London's appetite made exploitation easier because the clients were not rare. They were plentiful. Every drawing room held women who felt their value shifting under time. Every fashionable street held women watching each other closely. Every household held a private fear that could not be spoken without consequence. The salon did not create these fears. It monetized them. Monetizing a fear is a kind of clarity. It tells you exactly what the city will pay to avoid. The city also wanted a woman to blame. Once the scandal became public, London's appetite changed shape. It moved from wanting miracles to wanting punishment. It wanted to laugh, to sneer, to condemn. It wanted to turn the discomfort of its own participation into the comfort of moral superiority. This is a common switch. A society will indulge a market quietly and then, when embarrassed, punish it loudly. The punishment restores the illusion of purity. That illusion is what the city truly purchases at the end of a scandal. The clients are therefore not simply victims. They are participants in a social arrangement that traded money and secrecy for hope. That arrangement did not begin with Madame Rachel and did not end with her conviction. It was part of the city's structure. The way it treated women's faces as public property, the way it turned aging into social risk, the way it forced private needs into private solutions. If London had been kinder, the salon would have been less profitable. If women had been freer, the promise would have had less power. If reputation had been less lethal, secrecy would have been a weaker currency. But London was not kind, and women were not free, and reputation was lethal. So the door stayed busy. This is the point where the reader's temptation returns, to frame the story as cautionary entertainment. A clever fraudster, silly ladies, a famous street, a public trial, an ending. Entertainment provides distance. Distance protects the reader from recognizing the pattern. Because the pattern is not Victorian. It is human. Where a society makes something necessary and shameful at the same time, it creates markets that thrive on secrecy. Where it punishes people for needing help, it creates industries that promise help without exposure. Where it worships appearance, it creates predators who learn how to sell it. Madame Rachel was one such predator. But she was also a symptom. And symptoms persist as long as the conditions remain. London wanted the promise. London wanted the secrecy. London wanted the ending. It got all three. And then it returned to its mirrors as if nothing had happened. Still measuring, still watching, still hungry for the next door that would open quietly on a fashionable street. Chapter 12. The Mirror's Lesson. The case did not end with a sentence. It ended with a behaviour change. That is what scandals do when they are absorbed properly by a city. They teach people how to survive the next one. The lesson is rarely moral. It is practical. It is about what to hide, what to deny, what to call foolishness, when it is safer than calling it need. London learned quickly. Operators learned to soften their claims. They learned to trade the grand promise for the plausible one. Forever was too bold, improvement could be defended. Miracle invited laughter, method invited trust. They learned to borrow the language of medicine more carefully, treatments, courses, specialists, because science was becoming the era's new authority, and authority is a shield. They also learned to reduce paper. Receipts are useful when a business is honest. They are dangerous when it isn't. Names in ledgers become handles for law to grab. So records become thinner, and transactions become harder to trace. Trust becomes the mechanism rather than documentation. Trust is harder to prosecute. Clients learned, too. They learned that their fear could be weaponized twice, first by the operator who sold them secrecy, and then by the court that stripped secrecy away. They learned that there is a particular cruelty in being exposed for wanting what society told them they should want. They learned the cost of being a respectable woman who admits she is frightened. So they became quieter. They changed routes. They used intermediaries. They paid through others. They chose operators who promised discretion not as a courtesy but as a necessity. They learned to avoid melodrama, to avoid words like forever, to avoid leaving anything that could be lifted into a file. The mirror taught them caution. The public learned a different lesson. It learned how to consume a woman's humiliation as entertainment without feeling responsible for it. It learned how to treat the clients as foolish and therefore deserving of mockery. It learned how to treat the operator as monstrous and therefore deserving of whatever punishment the state required. This distribution of contempt allowed the city to feel clean. Cleanliness, here, is a story London tells itself. In that story, the scandal becomes proof that the system works. Deception is discovered, punished, removed. The city can return to believing that respectability is reliable, that Bond Street is safe, that the law protects the innocent, that the vulnerable simply need to be more sensible. But the mirror does not care about the story. It keeps reflecting the same pressures. It reflects the aging face. It reflects the husband's wandering attention. It reflects the social circle tightening. It reflects the silent competition between women trained to smile while assessing one another. It reflects the body changing regardless of virtue. The mirror keeps producing the same demand. And where demand persists, supply returns. This is the real afterlife of Madame Rachel, not her legend, but her model. A model built on 3 ingredients. A promise tailored to social fear. An intimate space that produces confession. And the conversion of confession into control. Once a model exists, it does not need the original operator to survive. It is replicated in quieter forms. London's beauty economy continues, because it is not merely about vanity. It is about safety in a system where women's safety is conditional. It is about the desire to remain protected in rooms where protection depends on being pleasing. It is about the dread of becoming less visible to affection and more visible to judgment. This is why the story is not a closed moral. It is an exposure. It shows how the city trains women to treat their faces as assets, and then punishes them for trying to protect those assets. It shows how a respectable culture creates shame and then sells relief from shame behind closed doors. It shows how law can punish one operator and leave the machinery intact. The machinery is the true antagonist. Because the machinery does not sit in one salon. It sits in every room where women learn to apologize for existing visibly. It sits in every conversation where youth is praised like virtue. It sits in every silence where need is hidden because admitting it would be dangerous. Madame Rachel's case is remembered because it is dramatic. But the mirror's lesson is quieter and more lasting. It tells women, do not admit how frightened you are. It tells operators, sell the fear, but don't let the sale be seen. It tells the city, laugh, condemn, move on. And it tells the reader something that is harder to accept than any tidy verdict. The promise did not die because it was false. It died because it became public. In London, that is what truly kills things. Not untruth. Exposure. Chapter 13, The Imitation. After the scandal, London pretended it had learned a moral. What it learned was technique. The city did not abandon the appetite that fed Madame Rachel's rooms. It adjusted how that appetite was served. The promises became smaller, the packaging cleaner, the language more respectable. The same longing was carried forward under new names, because a longing doesn't vanish when a court disapproves of the person who sold it. It simply looks for a safer shopfront. Imitation begins almost immediately in these stories. Not as homage, but as opportunism. Where one operator falls, others study the fall. They study the phrases that attracted attention, the sums that raised suspicion, the paper trails that became evidence. They learn what kind of visibility triggers law, and what kind of discretion keeps a business functioning. They learn that forever is a mistake, and that certainty must be sold in smaller doses. They learn to offer hope in language that cannot be prosecuted as easily. The imitation also works in reverse. Respectable people, embarrassed by what they have witnessed, imitate distance. They repeat the case as entertainment, shaping it into a joke that puts them safely outside it. They tell the story with an arched eyebrow and a cruel amusement, as if no sane person could ever have been tempted. This performance of superiority becomes part of the city's recovery. Superiority is a comfort. It turns fear into laughter and laughter into innocence. But innocence is not what the case produced. It produced caution. In the wake of public exposure, the world of private beauty work becomes more layered. A woman no longer goes straight to the most visible door. She asks softly first. She tests a name. She watches how it lands. She uses a friend's recommendation not as social gossip but as screening. The market becomes less open and therefore, in a certain way, more dangerous. A hidden trade has fewer checks. A client who is ashamed has less capacity to complain. An operator who knows this can be bolder behind closed doors. Shame is an excellent business partner. The imitation spreads because it fits the era's structure. Victorian respectability creates a constant need for quiet maintenance, whitening, smoothing, tightening, brightening, the endless small corrections that allow a woman to appear as if she has never struggled. The more a culture insists that beauty is effortless, the more effort is forced underground. The effort doesn't disappear. It becomes a secret routine. That routine is where imitators thrive. They do not need to invent a new desire. They only need to offer permission. Permission is often sold as exclusivity, private consultations, limited clients, society methods, foreign techniques. Exclusivity does two jobs at once. It flatters the client and it protects the operator. A client who believes she is chosen is less likely to complain publicly, because complaint would mean admitting she joined the chosen and still ended up fooled. The client becomes invested in the illusion. Investment is what keeps the door opening. The law, meanwhile, continues to exist at a distance. It is present like weather. Everyone knows it can change, but no one plans their day around it until the air turns sharp. The beauty market learns to stay below the storm line, to avoid the kind of boldness that produces headlines, to avoid the kind of paper that produces proof, to avoid the kind of client who produces noise. Noise is what brings officials. So the operators become quieter. Quieter does not mean kinder. It means more careful about what can be proven. This is the point at which the beauty woman becomes part of a larger Victorian pattern, women operating in the gray spaces between what is permitted and what is needed. The era produces many such women: midwives, fortune-tellers, spiritualists, abortionists, moneylenders and parlors, women selling relief under the cover of domesticity. Their work exists because official structures refuse to meet the needs they serve. Refusal creates markets. Markets create figures who are both helpful and threatening. Madame Rachel's story is one version of this pattern, dressed in velvet and glass, fitted with a fashionable address. The imitators that follow are not all frauds in the same way. Some genuinely believe in what they sell. Some offer small comforts that do no harm. Some exploit more brutally than she did, because they have learned how the city treats complainants. Complainants are the risk. And the city has proven it will punish them with ridicule. This is how imitation becomes a kind of shadow history. The public sees the spectacle and believes it is an ending. Behind the spectacle, the behavior continues, slightly altered, slightly disguised, still fed by the same fear. A woman sits at a mirror and feels time tightening around her. She reaches for something she can do. She chooses a method she can keep private. She buys a promise small enough to sound rational. Rational promises are the most persuasive. They do not have to be true. They only have to be survivable to believe in. This is what the city wanted most after the trial: survivable beliefs. Beliefs that allow routine to return without self-examination. Beliefs that keep women blaming themselves rather than blaming the system that cornered them. Beliefs that allow the market to continue without becoming a scandal again. In that sense, The Imitation is not merely the work of entrepreneurs. It is the work of London itself. A city that demands women be beautiful as proof of their worth will always create a trade in beauty. A city that demands women be modest about wanting beauty will always force that trade into secrecy. A city that humiliates women for being deceived will always protect the deceiver. This is the Imitation's true shape. Not a copy of one salon, but a replication of the conditions that made the salon possible. And conditions, unlike operators, do not go to court. Chapter 14: The Price of Being Seen. In London, a woman could be punished for two opposite offences: for wanting attention, and for losing it. This contradiction sat at the center of the city's beauty economy. It was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. A woman was expected to be desirable, but not to admit she cared about desirability. She was expected to remain youthful, but not to show the work required to do so. She was expected to appear effortless, and then blamed for the effort when it became visible. Visibility was the true risk. Madame Rachel's case did not only expose a salon. It exposed the fear that drove women into those rooms, and London responded to that exposure with something it knew well: ridicule. Ridicule is cheap. It costs the listener nothing and buys them distance. It allows a person to say, "I would never," and feel safe. Safety, in this context, is a lie a city tells itself. Because the fear Madame Rachel sold was not rare. It was ordinary. It sat in every drawing room where a younger woman entered and the air shifted slightly. It sat in every marriage where affection felt conditional. It sat in every social circle where women performed ease while measuring each other with the precision of accountants. The difference between her clients and the women laughing at them was often only circumstance. But circumstance is everything. A woman who could laugh at the scandal was often a woman who could afford not to confess her own bargains. She could afford to pretend she did not need private solutions. She could afford to treat the desire for protection as vanity rather than as survival. Other women could not afford that posture. For them, being seen was a kind of danger. Seen aging. Seen wanting. Seen trying. Seen failing. Seen most of all, as replaceable. Replaceable is the word that keeps the market alive. It is the word that turns beauty from decoration into defense. The salon offered a defense that was intimate enough to feel like care. The court turned that defense into evidence. And the public turned that evidence into entertainment. This three-step process is a kind of social punishment cycle. The city creates a pressure, sells relief from the pressure, then humiliates the people who purchased relief. Humiliation is how order is restored. It teaches women to carry their fear alone. It also teaches them to hide their methods better. After the trial, clients did not become less afraid of aging. They became more afraid of exposure. That fear altered the market more effectively than any sentence. It changed how women moved through the city. It changed what they dared to admit to friends. It changed which doors they chose. It changed the types of operators they trusted. It also changed the terms of the bargain. A woman seeking help after the scandal would be less likely to go somewhere bold and visible, because boldness now read as danger. She would be more likely to seek a smaller, quieter arrangement, something that looked domestic, informal, natural. Something that did not require a fashionable address to feel legitimate. Legitimacy became a problem. Bond Street legitimacy had been revealed as counterfeit. So legitimacy had to be rebuilt elsewhere, in a friend's recommendation, in a doctor's language borrowed and misused, in the comfort of routine, in the promise that no one would ever know. No one will ever know is the most persuasive product on offer. It is also the most dangerous. Because once secrecy becomes the primary commodity, the balance of power shifts even further toward the operator. A client who values secrecy above results is easier to hold. A client who fears ridicule will accept poorer outcomes. A client who believes exposure would ruin her will tolerate escalation in cost, because cost can be explained as misfortune. Exposure looks like disgrace. Disgrace is what Victorian women were trained to dread. The disgrace of looking foolish. The disgrace of looking needy. The disgrace of being revealed as a person with a body, with fear, with time moving across her face like weather. This is where the true crime element of the story deepens. It is not only that a woman committed fraud. It is that the city made fraud safer by punishing victims. A client thinking of complaining had to imagine the public's response. Not sympathy, but amusement. Not protection, but judgment. Not a shared recognition of how the system worked, but an individual shaming. You should have known better. You should have known better is a sentence London loves. It gives the city permission to keep its cruelty intact. The operator benefits from that cruelty. The operator can threaten less, because the client threatens herself. The client's own imagination becomes the operator's strongest tool. The client pictures the newspaper paragraph, the whispered laughter, the friend's face hardening into contempt. And so she stays quiet. She pays again. She tells herself she is choosing discretion. Choice is complicated when shame is involved. Shame narrows choices until they resemble compliance. This is why the scandal's most lasting consequence is not legal. It is behavioral. It pushes the beauty economy deeper into the private sphere, where it cannot be supervised and where clients are less likely to resist. It teaches women that seeking help openly is dangerous. It teaches them to manage their fear privately, even when that management makes them vulnerable to exploitation. A city that punishes confession creates perfect conditions for predation. The price of being seen, then, is paid in two directions. Paid by the women who went to the salon and then had to endure the public's laughter. And paid by the women who never went, but learned from the laughter that they must never admit they might have been tempted. That second payment is quieter, but it is larger. It is the payment of silence. Silence keeps the system stable. It also keeps women isolated, each one believing she is alone in her fear. Isolation makes markets more profitable, because it prevents collective resistance. Women cannot compare notes if they cannot speak. The city prefers it that way. A society that wants women to remain controllable will always prefer isolated women to connected ones. So the scandal becomes an instruction manual written in embarrassment. Do not be seen wanting. Do not be seen bargaining. Do not be seen in the wrong doorway. Do not, above all, be seen trying to escape time. Time will take you anyway, the city implies, and if you fight it too obviously, it will punish you twice, once for failing and once for daring. Madame Rachel sold a promise against time. London answered with a lesson about visibility. And that lesson, carried forward quietly from woman to woman, becomes one of the most enduring parts of the case. Not the jars. Not the slogans. Not the courtroom. The understanding that in this city, being seen is the most expensive thing a woman can afford. Chapter 15, The Real Commodity. If the salon had only sold creams, it would not have become notorious. Creams are forgettable. They sit on shelves, they fail quietly, they are replaced by the next jar with the next label. Even the most extravagant promises can be absorbed as harmless folly when the only thing at stake is a woman's money and a little bruised pride. Madame Rachel's business became something else because it sold a more volatile product. Access. Access to a private room. Access to an operator who spoke with authority. Access to an intimate routine that made clients feel known. Access, most importantly, to the fantasy that a woman could negotiate the terms of her own visibility. That fantasy is intoxicating in a culture that insists she cannot. The salon's real commodity was not youth. It was control. Control over fear, over time, over a husband's wandering gaze, over the social circle's quiet assessment. Control over the story a woman's face told when she entered a room. The operator did not have to guarantee actual transformation. She only had to guarantee the feeling that transformation was possible, and that possibility was a form of power the client could hold close. Holding close is where control turns into dependence. Because once a woman believes a private method is protecting her, she becomes frightened of losing it. She becomes willing to pay to maintain it. She becomes willing to tolerate disappointment in the product if the ritual still feels like protection. The ritual becomes the thing she cannot give up, because giving it up would mean facing the world without an imagined shield. An imagined shield can keep a person alive. It can also be used to trap them. This is why the salon's greatest value lay in its secrecy. Secrecy turned access into privilege. Privilege made clients loyal. Loyalty created patterns of return, and patterns created leverage. The operator's knowledge of a client's habits, how often she came, what she asked for, what she admitted in moments of panic, became part of the business's structure. Even without direct threats, that knowledge shaped behavior. The client begins to manage herself on the operator's behalf. Self-management is the most efficient form of control. The operator also sold something that looks harmless but is deeply potent: attention. Not the casual attention of a friend, but the concentrated attention of a person whose livelihood depends on making you feel that your fear is reasonable and solvable. A woman who was forced to pretend composure everywhere else could sit in that chair and, for a moment, stop performing. She could admit vulnerability and have it met with certainty rather than judgment. Certainty, delivered at the right time, is a kind of sedative. A sedated person is easier to guide. The salon was therefore a place where women paid to be managed. They did not think of it that way. They thought of it as care, improvement, maintenance. But the behavior tells the truth: return visits despite doubt, payments despite anger, silence despite exploitation. The business model relied on that behavior, and the behavior relied on shame. Shame is the city's most reliable ingredient. It does not need to be manufactured inside the salon. It arrives with the client. It arrives as the unspoken understanding that to want beautiful forever is ridiculous, and yet to fear aging is normal, and yet to admit the fear is dangerous. These contradictions create a perfect customer, a woman who wants relief and cannot complain without harming herself. A customer who cannot complain is a captive market. Once the scandal breaks, the city chooses to describe the business in a simpler way. It says, fraud. Fraud is a word that reassures the public because it suggests clarity. Someone lied, someone believed, someone paid, someone was punished. It makes the case feel like a contained moral problem rather than a symptom of wider cruelty. But fraud is only the outer shell. Inside is something more revealing: a society where women's safety is conditional, and where conditional safety can be sold. Sold by husbands, by families, by social circles, by employers, by the law itself. The beauty market is one expression of that larger trade. Madame Rachel's scandal is therefore not just a story about deception. It is a story about how a city prices women. It prices them by youth and freshness, by desirability and restraint, by how well they can maintain the illusion that they require nothing. It then forces them to purchase that illusion behind private doors. A private door is never just a door. It is a boundary between what can be admitted and what must be hidden. Madame Rachel operated precisely on that boundary. She learned how to stand there and collect payment from women who could not afford to step fully into public confession. She learned how to make secrecy feel like comfort. She learned how to make comfort feel like necessity. Necessity is what keeps the money flowing. This is why the case lingers. Not because the promise was especially inventive, but because it was perfectly calibrated to Victorian London's moral economy. The scandal exposed that economy for a moment, and then the city quickly covered it again with laughter and punishment, because covering is how it survives. But the underlying exchange remains visible once seen. A society that demands women look a certain way will always create someone who sells that look. A society that shames women for wanting to secure their place will always create someone who sells discretion. A society that mocks victims will always protect the operator. The real commodity is not a cream. It is the quiet agreement that women will pay to avoid being seen as afraid. Madame Rachel simply learned how to invoice that agreement. Chapter 16. What the record can't say. A court record is full of words, and yet it is defined by silence. It can tell you what was said, what was claimed, what was paid, what was promised. It can list dates and sums and locations. It can capture the language of accusation and defense. It can preserve the official shape of a scandal. What it cannot preserve cleanly is the texture of the private life that produced the case. That private life is where the story truly lived. When the law looks at a salon like Madame Rachel's, it sees a transaction. The woman says she can do something, the client pays, the thing is not done, and money has been taken under false pretenses. The law is built for this kind of clarity because clarity is enforceable. But the salon was not only a transaction. It was a relationship built inside social fear. That relationship does not translate well into legal language, because legal language cannot admit certain truths without destabilizing the social order it protects. One of those truths is the cruelty of the demand. The record will not say, women were cornered. It will not say, a woman's face could determine her security. It will not say, aging was treated like a moral failure and punished with social exclusion. Instead, it will say, vanity. Vanity is the respectable explanation for female fear. It makes the client culpable in a way that does not require London to examine itself. Another truth the record struggles to hold is the intimacy of the arrangement. The salon is a space where women are touched, examined, spoken to softly. It is a space that resembles care. That resemblance matters, because people are more easily influenced when they feel cared for. The record can describe appointments, preparations, treatments, but it cannot convey the psychological effect of being attended to in a world that otherwise demanded composure and denial. Denial is a kind of daily violence. The operator offered temporary relief from that violence. Relief is not innocence, but it explains the pull. The record also cannot comfortably say what secrecy meant. It can say private, confidential, discreet, as if these are neutral descriptors. In reality, secrecy functioned like a contract. It bound the client to the operator and the operator to the client. It turned shame into currency. It made complaints dangerous. It made silence rational. The law relies on complaints. So it cannot easily acknowledge why complaints were costly. Instead, it treats silence as puzzling, or foolish, or complicit. But silence in Victorian London was often self-protection. A woman might stay silent not because she did not feel wronged, but because speaking would expose her to ridicule and to the judgment of men. Speaking could damage a marriage. Speaking could damage her standing with other women. Speaking could damage the fragile network of approvals and invitations that functioned as her social insurance. The record cannot say, women did not have insurance. So it records their silence as if it were simply choice. Choice becomes a convenient fiction. The record also cannot say what kind of harm is done by humiliation. A client may lose money, yes. But she may also lose confidence in her own perception. She may begin to distrust her judgment. She may feel foolish in a way that alters how she moves through the world. The record might include tears, outrage, indignation, but it cannot quantify the slow internal damage of being manipulated in an intimate setting. The law is not built to punish the theft of dignity. It punishes theft of property. And in Victorian London, dignity was treated as a woman's responsibility to maintain, regardless of how others handled her. This is another silence the record carries. The record also tends to simplify the operator. It makes her either criminal or not criminal. It reduces her to intent. It does not linger on what shaped her skills, the city's hierarchies, the need to perform respectability, the limited routes available to women who wanted autonomy. This is not to excuse her. It is to recognize that a case file is a kind of weapon. It is designed to strike a target, not to map a whole environment. Mapping an environment would implicate too many people. Too many structures. Too much of London itself. So the record gives the city what it needs, a villain who can be punished. Punishment creates closure, and closure is the record's final purpose. But closure is not understanding. Understanding requires noticing what is missing. It requires noticing that the client's motives have been collapsed into vanity. It requires noticing that the salon's intimacy has been flattened into service. It requires noticing that the leverage created through secrecy is treated as incidental rather than central. It requires noticing that ridicule is an unspoken accomplice to exploitation. Once you notice what the record cannot say, the case changes shape. It stops being a neat moral tale. It becomes an anatomy, not only of one operator's methods, but of a society's pressures that made women desperate enough to buy hope, and ashamed enough to keep buying even when hope began to thin. The record gives us the public story. The public story matters. But the private story, what women feared, what they could not admit, what made a promise like beautiful forever sound briefly possible, is what turns this from a curiosity into a true crime history. Because the crime is not only what the operator did. It is also what the city required women to endure, and then mocked them for trying to survive. Chapter 17, The Hunger That Remains. A scandal ends, but the hunger that fed it does not. The city may punish an operator, close a door, and declare itself cleansed, yet the demand that made the business profitable continues to move through households like a draft. Victorian London did not stop measuring women after Madame Rachel. It did not soften its rules. It did not grant women safer exits from reputational threat. It did not become less amused by female humiliation. The machinery remained intact. So the hunger remained intact as well. It lived in the same places it always lived.
in mirrors, in invitations, in the shift of a husband's attention, in the expressions of other women trained to notice and to compete. It lived in the silence around aging, in the way time was framed as a problem women were expected to solve privately. It lived in the idea that a woman could be penalized simply for changing in ways all bodies change. When a hunger is punished rather than understood, it learns to hide. After the trial, hunger became more discreet. It stopped announcing itself in grand slogans. It stopped risking fashionable visibility. It became a private routine carried out in smaller rooms, through smaller promises, behind doors that looked more domestic than commercial. But the hunger did not become less intense. If anything, the humiliation of the scandal sharpened it. Women learned not only to fear aging, but to fear being caught fearing it. That double fear is a powerful force. It makes women isolate themselves from one another. Isolation makes markets safer for predators. A woman who cannot speak to other women cannot compare notes. She cannot ask, "Is this normal?" She cannot say, "I think I'm being held." She cannot admit she wants help without risking ridicule. So she keeps her bargain private, and privacy becomes the operator's advantage. This is how the system protects itself. It trains women to treat shared vulnerability as shameful. In that environment, the next Madame Rachel does not need to be as bold. She does not need Bond Street. She does not need a sign that dares the city to laugh. She only needs a client list and an understanding of what the city makes women fear. She needs the ability to speak with authority, to perform care, and to offer secrecy as the first and most valuable service. Secrecy becomes the true luxury. It is also the most reliable trap. The hunger remains because it is not only about beauty. It is about safety. In a society where a woman's security can depend on being pleasing, beauty becomes a form of armor. When time threatens that armor, the threat feels existential. A woman may know intellectually that she is more than her face, but her world may punish her as if she is not. Knowing does not undo risk. Risk is what drives the purchase. This is why the story refuses to sit comfortably as a curiosity. It is easy to treat Madame Rachel as a spectacular fraud, a Victorian oddity, a cautionary tale about gullible society ladies. That treatment provides distance and allows laughter. But distance is another kind of denial. It denies the fact that the hunger she exploited was produced by ordinary social cruelty. Cruelty is not always dramatic. It can be polite. It can be a compliment that contains a warning. It can be an invitation withheld. It can be a look that reminds a woman she is being assessed. It can be the constant instruction to appear effortless while doing the labor of staying acceptable. That labor is endless. So the hunger remains endless too. And because it remains, the market remains. This market will keep producing operators who understand how to profit from the gap between what women are expected to be and what women can actually endure. It will keep producing private rooms where shame is handled gently and converted into payment. It will keep producing bargains that feel like choice until they begin to feel like captivity. The court can punish one operator. It cannot punish the gap. The gap is structural. It is built into the way Victorian London imagined womanhood, as an object meant to please, meant to remain young, meant to compete quietly, meant to suffer without speaking. In that imagination, the hunger for control is inevitable, and whoever offers control will find customers. Customers are not proof of foolishness. They are proof of pressure. So the hunger remains, and the story's ending becomes less final the longer it is held. The case closes, but the pattern stays open. A promise is made. A door is crossed. A fear is confessed. A secret is held. And somewhere in another room, another woman looks into a mirror and calculates what she can afford to lose. Not money, but protection. That is the hunger that remains. Conclusion. There is a particular quietness to the end of a Victorian scandal. It is not forgiveness. It is not healing. It is simply the city returning to its habits, because habits are how a society convinces itself it is stable. After the trial and the sentence, London resumes its normal cruelty with renewed discipline. It looks away more smoothly. It laughs more carefully. It teaches women to be discreet about their fear and teaches operators to be discreet about their methods. Discretion becomes the compromise that keeps everything functioning. Madame Rachel's name remains, but the woman becomes less important than the mechanism. This is what happens when a case turns into a warning. It is used.
It is repeated.
It is stripped down into something portable. Madame Rachel becomes a shorthand for fraud and vanity and foolish ladies, a phrase used to end conversations rather than begin understanding. The name becomes a way to seal the story shut. Sealing a story shut is how a city avoids recognizing itself. But the mechanism is still visible, even inside the sealed version. A society creates a pressure that women cannot speak about without punishment. It creates a market for private relief. That relief is sold by people who understand the value of shame. The shame isolates clients, preventing them from resisting collectively. When the market becomes too visible and threatens the respectable, the state intervenes, not to correct the pressure, but to restore appearances.
An operator is punished. Clients are ridiculed. The city declares itself corrected. Then it continues. This is the coda's only real truth. The scandal did not end the trade in beauty promises. It refined it. It did not free women from the terror of aging in public. It made that terror quieter. It did not encourage women to speak honestly about the cost of living under constant assessment. It taught them that honesty is expensive. The cost is paid in isolation. Isolation is the most enduring consequence of stories like this, because it is the one thing the city actively rewards. A woman who keeps her fear private is respectable. A woman who admits it is laughed at. A woman who complains is judged. The result is predictable. Women learn to carry their hunger alone. Carrying it alone makes them easier to sell to. In this way, the scandal closes like a trap. It punishes the most visible offender and strengthens the conditions that make the offense profitable. It is not an accident. It is how social order maintains itself. Order does not eliminate the forces that threaten it. It manages them by controlling where they can appear. So the door that Madame Rachel opened does not shut. It changes address. It changes vocabulary. It learns to be less theatrical. It becomes natural and scientific and recommended. It becomes the kind of thing a woman can do without ever admitting she is doing it. The most successful beauty promise is the one that allows a client to remain respectable while purchasing relief. Respectability is the product everyone keeps buying. This is why the story matters as historical true crime. It is not simply a period curiosity about jars and slogans. It is a case study in leverage, how private fear becomes commerce, and how commerce becomes control when secrecy is involved. It shows how a woman can be trapped not by chains but by embarrassment. It shows how a city can cooperate in exploitation by punishing confession. The violence here is not loud. It is social. It is the violence of a culture that demands women remain pleasing and then mocks them for trying. It is the violence of a legal system that can punish fraud but not address the conditions that make women easy to exploit. It is the violence of a public that prefers to laugh rather than recognize. Recognition would require responsibility. Responsibility is what London avoids. In the end, the case offers no comforting moral. It offers a mirror. Not the salon mirror that promised transformation, but the larger mirror of the city itself, a reflection of what Victorian London demanded, what it denied, what it paid for, and what it punished once it became embarrassed. Madame Rachel promised beauty without time. London responded with a lesson about visibility. And the most lasting consequence is not her sentence. It is the understanding that a woman's fear can be used against her twice, first by the person who sells relief, and then by the society that mocks her for needing it. That is the true coda. A city that wants women quiet will always have a market for quiet solutions. And a quiet market will always have someone willing to sell a promise that sounds, for a moment, like rescue. Bibliography. Primary sources. Great Britain. Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey. The Extraordinary Life and Trial of Madame Rachel at the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey, London, on the 22, 23, 24 and September 25, 1868. The report copied verbatim from the Times. London, 1868. The Proceedings of the Old Bailey online. Trial records and background materials for the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey. Secondary sources. Rappaport, Helen. Beautiful Forever, Madame Rachel of Bond Street, cosmetician, con artist and blackmailer. London, publisher varies by edition, 2010. Rappaport, Helen. Beautiful Forever, The True Story of Madame Rachel. Essay/article, Helen Rappaport website. Tertiary/general reference. Atlas Obscura. The Victorian influencer who peddled poisonous beauty elixirs. Wikipedia contributors. Sarah Rachel Russell, Madam Rachel.